board, and Peter Tanner, who is unable to make it, will set up a recordings for us through our YouTube, and we'll make that available. Okay, so I think Ryan, is that Tom or Ryan that's done that?
Hi, President Brett. It's Ryan. I just shared my screen, but I'll wait for Tom to give me the warm welcome or a welcome.
You know how warm that's going to be, right?
Yeah, just a welcome maybe. I'll see what Tom has to say. Thank you.
I'll try, but my connection is not 100% today. So Ryan is a lifelong Chatham-Kent resident. He's born and raised in Wallsburg. He's lived in Chatham since 2017. He's married to Hillary, who, by the way, keeps the legal department going. And they have two young boys, Everett, 3, and Henry, who's turning 1 on Saturday. So Ryan hasn't had much sleep in the last 3 or 4 years. He has a passion, and I can attest to this because I've known him all this time, has a passion for learning about and understanding our world through his own firsthand experiences. And this has led him on several adventures around the globe through the years, but obviously he always returns home. He has a degree in geography with specialization in urban development from Western. He also has a diploma in geographic information systems, an absolute must in our profession, and urban planning from Fanshawe. He has made his career with Municipality, Chatham-Kent. He started as a pup, as a summer student in 2007, and has progressively moved up the ranks. It's been gratifying for me to see him come along. He is now the Director of Planning Services in Chatham-Kent. And particularly these days, that's an extraordinarily important position. In this role, he brings in an in-depth knowledge of our community and a proven ability in advising municipal council, no small feat, I can tell you, committees and other stakeholders on planning matters. His experience and collaborative style greatly assists in advancing community development priorities. So please welcome Ryan Jacques.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was wonderful. Very warm, and you took the words right out of my mouth, I think.
Well, you wrote it.
That's right. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time addressing a Rotary Club in quite a few years, and it's an honor to do so here in Chatham today. I just wanted to address first the elephant in the room. COVID and the lockdowns have gotten the best of me. So since Christmas, I stopped getting regular haircuts and I stopped shaving. So this is not the normal look for me, but I just want to point out that you may have seen me around, or you may see me in the future once I get back to regular grooming. And this is generally what I look like without the beard.
Right.
So probably spend a few minutes. I haven't timed my presentation, but I know maybe about 20 minutes or so. A short outline. I want to touch on a personal story on how Rotary in the past has enriched my life, for which I'm forever grateful and indebted to Rotary International. Then moving on, I'll provide a bit of an outlook on community growth and development in Chatham-Kent. This is one topic in which I'm heavily involved in locally, and there are many other planning topics, that I could prepare separate presentations on that I won't at all be speaking about today. And, and these include, the evolution and advancement of agriculture in our community, the impacts of natural hazards like flooding and erosion, and the impact of climate change, supporting vulnerable populations and providing safe and healthy communities, among other topics. But today it's mostly centered around growth and development. I want to sort of set the stage with some societal trends and local trends, which have helped me explain what it is that's going on in our community with respect to, the number of housing starts and people moving from other communities to our community, and even people moving within our community. And I'll leave off with how Chatham-Kent's responding, and ultimately what I'll leave everyone with is it's really up to our community. It's up to our local leaders and decision makers to really determine where we go from here, as our future is not predetermined, but certainly we have a great impact on what our future will look like depending on our actions today. So I was a Rotary Youth Exchange student from this district and outbound in 2000, 2001. I sort of fell into it. I skipped going out for lunch one day, and Terrence McNaughton was a teacher at Wallsburg District Secondary School and said, "Ryan, why don't you come to the lecture hall and learn about Rotary Youth Exchange?" I thought, well, okay, sure. I'm not doing anything else over lunch, and I'll come along. Without really thinking about it, one thing led to another. I was signed up, went through the 3 or 4 orientations within the district here in Ontario and Michigan, and before you know it, I was on the very first flight of my life out of Detroit. 4 flights and 36 hours later, I landed in Cairns in North Queensland in Australia. I truly believe I won the Rotary Youth Exchange Lottery. Cairns is a wonderful medium-sized city in the far north of Queensland. It's a gateway to the Great Barrier Reef, Daintree rainforest, and a stone's throw from the Australian outback. Met wonderful people involved in Rotary in Cairns through the Sunrise Club there, as well as other students and local Australians who I have relationships with to this day. This is picture of the inbounds to District 9550 on one of our trips around the country, sort of later in my stay. So again, 21 years later, I thank Rotary. I thank your club specifically even now for continuing to do what you may be doing to support youth exchange in our community. And I can tell you that every student and everybody you send out and bring in, you change their lives, and it's pretty special. So I haven't talked about Australia in a long time. It got me going there. So back to planning. Some key points I want to bring out right at the outset here, and this is a bit of a highlight of what's to come. I just want to point out that to a certain extent, what's happening in our community is somewhat beyond our control. Demographic trends are predictable. They're happening and they don't stop happening, and we use them in land use planning to anticipate changing needs as time goes on. Something else that's relatively beyond our control is migration patterns, both international migrants and intra-provincial migrants coming to Canada, Ontario, and moving throughout Ontario. You'll hear that, over the last 5 or 6 years, outmigration from Toronto has put upward pressure on house prices in many regions, including smaller centers like Chatham and those within Chatham-Kent. Locally, housing prices and new starts have increased steadily, which since 2016, which we all know. We've read the news, and we may have experienced this ourselves if we've bought or sold property in this time frame. I won't get into employment too much, but it is definitely related. Our indicators are very favorable, actually, when compared to the region and provincial averages. We'll see what happens over the next year or two as the pandemic sort of wanes and the next phase of our journey here as Ontarians gets underway. And then again, really I want to emphasize that future local decision making to allocate scarce resources that we do control will help tell our story and where we go from here on out. So really starting at a high level, it's really important that I highlight some societal trends, specifically, like I mentioned, demographics and migration. These are things happening all around us, and they're difficult for us as individuals to quantify, but luckily, upper levels of government and agencies and academic institutions certainly study this and provide data and information, which I'm always seeking out to help inform local decision making and advice. that I give to decision makers. In 2008, I actually met an author, Canadian economist, David Foote. He wrote several books, and one was Boom, Bust, and Echo. Probably wrote that about 20 years ago now, I would say. And one of the things he said during his presentation was demographics explains 2/3 of everything. And I've always remembered that. So when I'm confused or when I'm faced with a challenge in my work, I tend to start at demographics and then sort of bring in other factors from there. And I just want to point out that the peak demographic age, so there are more people currently in Ontario at the age of 57 than any other age. So, you know, these folks are obviously part of the baby boomer generation, and they're the largest cohort of people in Canada and within Ontario. And, you know, to a large extent, it is this group in our population and their characteristics in being a relatively wealthy cohort compared to history. They're at or nearing retirement age with generally low debt levels, and they're generally mobile. So, you know, this is a very influential group of people in our province. And, you know, many of them are moving out of, you know, their larger homes in the GTA, and then they're choosing to move elsewhere, including to Chatham-Kent. You know, this is the same demographic cohort that really led to a housing boom in Ontario through the late 70s and early 80s. Ultimately, you know, the demise of that boom was a result of high interest rates, in part due to, you know, rapid inflation coming out of the 70s because of some energy crisis and oil scarcity. And of course, that demographic at that time needed a lot of debt to buy new houses, so money was scarce. So, you know, to respond to inflation and to the demand for debt, interest rates obviously went very high into the low 20%, and ultimately that changed things through the mid to late 80s. Now, while that demographic group is influencing us today, certainly those other factors are not present currently. There are definitely other economic factors that will lead to a different outcome, you know, through the 2020s and maybe 2030s. I also wanted to point out, don't worry about these lines. This is really just here to impress you that I've done research and that I'm not making this up. But in general, there has been, since 2015, more outmigration from Toronto to other communities. And this is within all age groups, not just, you know, that 50 to 60 age groups. Really all age groups are recorded to be moving out of the Toronto metropolitan area, as well as, you know, in this graph, Vancouver, but this is consistent with major cities across Canada. And they're not necessarily, people are not necessarily moving from, say, Toronto to Chatham. But by and large, they are moving to sort of secondary cities within the province, such as Oshawa and Barrie and Hamilton. And while the data is not out yet, and it may very well not come out for some time, you know, it's then, you know, the domino effect of people moving from secondary cities to tertiary cities, London, Windsor, and ultimately, you know, people find their way to Chatham and, you know, Blenheim and Tilbury and Wheatley and so on within Chatham-Kent. So we are not alone in Ontario. Every single community in the province and across Canada is experiencing the effects of this trend in their communities in their own way. Quickly touch on this too. It's not just people moving around Ontario, it's people moving to Canada and to Ontario. So over the last couple of years before the pandemic, Canada was accepting, you know, around 400,000 international immigrants to Canada, and many were residing in our largest population centers. There's actually a backlog of international in-migration to Canada due to the pandemic. So when the pandemic's over, not only will the demographic trend and the societal trends that I mentioned continue, there'll also be a considerable level of in-migration of new people settling in Canada, which will further contribute to upward pressure of housing prices. And certainly these people contribute positively to our society and our economy. So I've sort of talked about a couple of the things that I've learned that are happening in Ontario, but now a couple of things that I know for a fact that are happening within Chatham-Kent, and these are trends in housing. And like I said, I'll touch briefly on trends in employment. This image actually is from a few months ago of a new 6-story apartment building on Park Avenue West in Chatham. That building is topped out at 6 stories, and it's due to receive its first occupants in October. And a mirror image of this building will start to be constructed right next door later in June of this year. This is just one example of a on-the-ground development project that is happening in part due to those trends that I've discussed. So as far as housing, just some quick hits I'll give you. I don't want to get into the stats too much, but I do want to paint the picture here. Last year, Chatham-Kent issued in and around 275 building permits for new residential buildings. This was a noticeable increase from the 200 in 2019 and less than 150 in the years prior. Notable that with these permits, it's led to actually a larger increase in actual new residential units. So permits through 16 to 18 led to 125 to maybe 175 new housing units, whether it be an apartment or a townhome or a new detached home. But some of the demand for other types of housing, such as apartment units, has really led to a modest increase in the number of permits to a more significant increase to the number of new residential units. And this is specifically related to some apartment permits that were given in 2020. And I can tell you anecdotally that 2021 will exceed 2020's numbers as far as new residential building permits and new residential housing starts total. As Tom mentioned, I work in the planning department. So, land use planners, we're not permitting new developments as far as we're not on the ground issuing permits, inspecting and giving occupancy to these new builds. Those are good building inspectors. But one of our responsibilities is to accept, assess, and ultimately recommend a course of action of approval for planning applications such as zoning amendments to allow different uses on properties, draft plans of subdivision, which ultimately lead to farmland being converted into new urban neighborhoods, and single site developments where individual properties are being developed for non-residential uses. So I'd just like to share some of my observations around that, those planning approvals or those development proposals. So in the mid-2010s, the municipality averaged around 150 planning packages being taken in any given year. This has steadily increased since 2016 and consistent with trends across Ontario. I was actually a little bit surprised by this next one. To the end of April of this year, our planning application volume equaled that to the end of July of last year. So in 4 months this year, we've experienced what we experienced in 7 months last year. And in 4 months of this year, we've taken in half the amount of what we took in all of 2020. So it's a pretty good indicator that it'll be another record-setting year as far as development approvals across Chatham-Kent. And with volumes of applications, certainly the complexity of these submissions have also increased. So, we're still getting farm splits and dwelling severances and, minor variances so people can build maybe a little bit bigger of a garage or things like that. But with the increase of applications, we're also seeing larger and more complex subdivisions and site developments and bylaw amendments. Of the like that in my career, I've not had the same experience with. Quickly touching on employment here, I don't want to overlook this because our housing and our population is inextricably linked to employment opportunities in Chatham-Kent. So through the pandemic, and we've actually had more favorable unemployment numbers than the Ontario and Canadian average. And our labor force participation rate is also bouncing back a little bit. It'll be interesting to see what's happening here. But anecdotally from my colleagues in our economic development department, they keep telling me that there are a lot of vacant positions and there's a lot of growing businesses within the community. So certainly we're hearing from employers that, their main challenges are attracting a skilled and available workforce. And, it's these housing starts and these new homes and people moving to Chatham-Kent that is a major contributor to the solution of providing our local employers with a stable and quality workforce. So the Ministry of Finance for Ontario estimates Chatham-Kent's population last year to be about 106,000. Obviously, we peaked a little over 110,000 back in 2006, and with the changes in the manufacturing sector, our population probably bottomed out just over 100,000. I think we're pretty close on getting back to 5 digits there for a little while, but ultimately I don't think we did. We're on our way back to that 2006 population level. I expect maybe we won't hit it in the 2021 census, but in the long view, I think even by the 2026 census, we'll have reached a new max population for the municipality above 110,000 if this trend continues. And it was reported that 30% of home buyers in 2020 were from out of town, and this in part led to the average housing price increasing almost 25% over 2019 levels. My colleagues in community attraction division of the municipality, they're always surveying local people because the provincial and federal governments don't really get too granular with any individual community like the size of Chatham-Kent. So in order to get some quantifiable information or even a snapshot of what we're experiencing, we do our own local surveying. And I think it's just important to point out that young people are moving here or staying here because they have friends and family in the area and they're gaining employment opportunities in the area. Immigrants and newcomers are choosing the area mainly for employment, maybe a family connection, and then also lifestyle, geographic location, and perhaps an educational opportunity. The top factors for people choosing to live in Chatham-Kent, not a surprise to me, is affordability. While locally, some people are perhaps struggling or being negatively impacted by local housing prices staying in this market, certainly even compared to Windsor, Sarnia, and London, Chatham-Kent is still much more affordable than those centers, and certainly much more affordable than most places in South Central Ontario. So thanks for staying with me. I know I've moved through a lot very quickly, but I really wanted to try to lay out and frame sort of what's happening in our community with regards to growth and development in such a way that might lead to some questions. It might lead to some more specific examples of what's actually happening in and around Chatham. And I'd certainly leave some of that specific stuff for questions and discussions after I finish up my presentation here in a few moments. Sort of aside from these known societal trends and local statistics, is an emerging trend being teleworking. So the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, has reported just in March that about 40% of Canadians that are working jobs that can be performed from home. I'm one of them. I'm working in a toy room. Basically, my whole house is a toy room, so my home office is not exempt from that fact here. Teleworking is a factor that will likely add to the impact on migration patterns within Ontario moving forward. And a telling statistic, which it will remain to be seen what happens here, but 25 to 30% of people living in large cities switch to teleworking, and only about 5 to 15% of people living in smaller communities switch to teleworking. This is primarily due to the fact that the types of jobs held by people in larger cities are perhaps more conducive to working from home, just based on the type of employment opportunities, large offices and different things that exist in larger cities. So a continuation of this trend will likely lead to more teleworking, even after COVID. Excuse me. That's not COVID, by the way. That's just a tickle. This trend could lead to greater outflows of people from larger to smaller cities where housing is generally less expensive and people can continue to perform their work. You could imagine a Google employee living in Kitchener moving to Chatham to work and maybe only visiting Kitchener once a week or once every 2 weeks to check in at the office and stand at the water cooler, with their colleagues. And this additional migration in teleworking may continue to place even more substantial upward pressure on housing prices in smaller centers over time. So this is certainly something that I believe we're starting to see in Chatham, but I think this is something that plays out over several years, even the rest of the decade potentially. So I'm packing a lot into this slide, but I don't have all the answers, but what I have are an opportunity here that I'd like to share with you. And this is an opportunity that's facing our local council. It's an opportunity that's facing other local decision makers, and it has to do about how Chatham-Kent is going to grow. So early last year, a municipal council approved a strategy called the CK Growth Plan. And this plan, really, it's a reprioritization of the plan that already existed, but it was an indication that there should be a concerted effort to support an enhanced quality of life in our municipality, in part through increased population, jobs, and new tax assessment. So our local councils expressed a strong commitment to growth as a priority, but also wishing to keep future property tax increases to reasonable levels. This presents a challenge as the municipality has very limited revenue sources and a very long list of future potential expenditures. So the strategy is a little bit of a three-pronged approach, this growth strategy. The first is really hitting on the municipality's financials, and it's looking at getting new revenue sources in the future through development charges, or what maybe is more generally referred to as lot levies. So this is new homes, new lots in developing areas to have a charge or a levy applied to it to help pay for some municipal capital expenditures that have in the past would otherwise just be paid by us all who own property through general tax increases. So there's an element of fairness that new municipal spending directly related to our growing community shouldn't be borne by people who are not benefiting from those new services as directly as those owners of those new homes. So it has been communicated to council from the municipal treasurer that in order for Chatham-Kent to position itself so that private developers can sustain and increase the levels of development that they're experiencing now, that the municipality would be obligated to spend upwards of $50 million over 5 years in order to pay for capital projects such as road upgrades, like arterial road upgrades, trunk sewers, regional stormwater management plans. These are things that a developer individually is not required to pay for out of pocket. Obviously, developers are required to pay for new local streets, new local services, connections to homes, but ultimately in a new subdivision, that developer needs a pipe to hook into, or they need a road to get to where their subdivision is. And those are the types of capital projects that a municipality is responsible for. And like I said, those can be funded through property taxes, they can be funded through development charges. And I think the right thing to do is to have a mix, and currently we don't have development charges, and that would be one way to do that. And I guess to another point on that is the municipality has relatively low debt level and relatively high reserves. So the municipality has done an excellent job over the past 15 years of paying down its debt, and it's accumulated over $100 million in reserves. So a strategy which has been put forward for discussion would be to issue debt or debentures against our large reserves and then pay that debt back through development charges over time as the community experiences growth. And that's essentially a textbook approach that most municipalities in Ontario are utilizing. But of course, there's so many factors, economic factors, political factors, and things like that, that will ultimately decide what Chatham-Kent does. So my point is, these trends of migration within Ontario due to demographics, due to teleworking opportunities, due simply to affordability, those will continue. And depending on what Chatham-Kent does as far as its investments, Chatham-Kent could continue to grow at or above the provincial average. And if it does not make the full extent of the investments, we may continue to grow, but we may continue to grow less than the regional or provincial average. So that really remains to be seen. Certainly the demand will continue to be there, but there are things that will need to be done so developers and homeowners can capitalize on that demand and move to Chatham-Kent rather than other areas in Ontario. The third prong of the growth strategy is really informing where those dollars should be spent and informing where new critical infrastructure should be put in the ground. So we're currently undertaking several background studies and look forward to more comprehensive land use policy updates. And these will really inform future strategic planning decisions over the next 2, 5, 10, and 20 years as time goes on. Certainly that would be building off of the current policy framework and the studies that we've already done in the past. I guess a thought that's just popped into my head now is, there's this saying, if you build it, they will come. And I think that's a little bit of a false statement. Sometimes it can be true, and sometimes it's not true. So it can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So really, people are coming. People are willing to come here. So if we build infrastructure and we build something in the wrong place, it won't be utilized, and our resources were maybe misallocated, and that's a situation where if you build it, they won't come. But if we build infrastructure strategically at the right place and the right time, people will inevitably come. So, you can see how in some cases that statement is true, in some cases is not true. And overall, any advice I give to my colleagues or municipal council would be to put the community in a position that if we do build, that people will come. And if that's done, it's certainly a possibility here for our future. So it's exactly 1 o'clock. So I hope I have timed that appropriately for this meeting, President Brett. Definitely open to any comments, discussion, or questions on anything that I've talked about or anything that I haven't talked about.
Great, Ryan. If you could stop sharing screen, I can look at everybody's happy faces here and just make sure I get it on gallery. There we go. And we're going to open the floor for questions, and then I'll ask Tom to thank our guest. But questions first, please. And I'm sure I'm expecting some. I'm going to start first because I've got the floor right at the moment. Ryan, a great presentation, and you certainly hit home. I live down on Morning Glory, right beside Enclave. Currently, while I was sitting here, 5 transports went by my house dumping gravel in my backyard, more or less, as they get ready to extend Enclave. So I've been watching the things going out there for the last month. That was one of my questions then. So the land developer that owns that property, he doesn't have to pay all the cost of laying the infrastructure in that's going out there. Some of that is taken care of through the municipality as well.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. That's a good question. So a little bit of background. Yeah, so the Prestantia subdivision, that was a large, 500 or 600 lot plan of subdivision that was approved in 1998. And, market conditions have led to the whole neighborhood, including where you live, to develop over time. And that developer now is responding, obviously, to the demand for service lots and has opted to go forward with another phase in behind your house. So I can tell you that the developer is responsible for 100% of the costs of the work that's going there now. But I guess the bigger picture, some of the things that Chatham-Kent would be responsible to pay for in part or in full would be some of that broader infrastructure. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So eventually Chatham-Kent will be responsible to change, say, Baldoon Road from Fatima School up to Gregory, from like a rural tar and chip road to a urban road. So they'll lower the road, close the drain, put curb and gutter and streetlights all the way out. So that's something outside of the developer subdivision. That's an infrastructure upgrade that's required as a direct result of growth. New cars traveling into the expanding subdivision. So the municipality has that responsibility. Another example is that eventually in North Chatham, there will be no further capacity in the local sewer distribution network. So say our Public Utilities Commission, for example, has a new pump station, several $1 million sanitary sewer pump station planned to service basically the land between Orangewood Boulevard and all the way over to Bear Line. Now that's a shared municipal and developer contribution in that regard. So the developer can only extend sewers so far before they're coming out of the ground, and you can no longer connect to them. So those pumping stations are important. It gives a new focal point for local sewers to connect to. That pump ultimately lifts it up or pushes it into an existing sewer system to ultimately take it to the sewage treatment plant. So a pumping station, for example, is not going to be entirely utilized by that developer. It will ultimately be utilized by other developers of other lands as well in all of North Chatham. So there's where there's that shared cost between a developer and the municipality. But those local streets and local sidewalks and things, 100% the developer. So.
Thanks, Ryan. Any other questions for Ryan here? I have a quiet crowd today. Andy Watson, and then Chandra. Oh, need you to unmute there, Andy. Sorry, some of you might have got muted by me when I kind of muted everybody to get started.
Are we on?
You're good to go.
Okay, the former international plant is something that's going to happen, and I'm just curious as what it is.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd just like to maybe make a comment on that. I think it's a wonderful thing for the community that Navistar and a private local owner were able to make that deal happen. It would have, long term, it would be a detriment to the community if Navistar just let that property ride as an expense on its books and essentially let the property rot for another 30 years with no local benefit. But the fact that there is a private interest who is willing to take on that risk and has the opportunity now to develop that over the long term, like that's just, it's a game changer for what's a very key area in the city, you know, the intersection of two very main roads in Kyle and Richmond. And certainly that can only have positive impacts in our community overall. So the plans have not formalized yet. I know this land acquisition has been years in the making, and development will continue to be years in the making. The lands are former industrial lands, obviously. I fully expect that there will be a mix of light industrial or industrial type uses, as well as maybe opportunity for some commercial type uses there. I fully expect that property, it's about 88 acres, will likely be subdivided over time and developed by other owners as those lots are created and sold off. So nothing's formalized yet as far as exact plans, but such is the nature of growth and development of a community is, you know, these things take time. As it took time, many years to get it to this point, and it'll likely, in my opinion, take many years to see it fully built out. So I don't have a specific answer for you, but we'll wait and see. But it is very hopeful for our community that this is even possible at this time.
I guess I can't help but wonder if or why the municipality itself did not want to be involved with the ownership of that and create industrial lots that they can dish out.
Yeah, it was an opportunity that was there, and ultimately the decision makers in our community opted to leave it to, you know, private market forces to have that happen. And I believe that the municipality is lucky for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. Chandra, you had a question?
I did. Not sure if you'll be able to speak to it or not. I was just curious with all the housing starts and so forth that are happening in Chatham-Kent. There's a chunk of land out where I live, Linwood, and not much seems to be happening with it or has happened with it in the last 10 years. And given that it's vacant land, I wondered if there was anything forthcoming in the future, just, you know, out of curiosity.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the southeast Chatham, sort of the former Harwich Township, that's an area that's not a designated or a planned growth area. Obviously, the other three corners of Chatham, you know, the Landings is experiencing development, Prestantia in the northwest, and obviously in the southwest, Indian Creek and Bloomfield. You know, as things evolved in the city over time, the southeast, sort of from the highway to the Creek Road and that area, were never planned to be fully serviced. And maybe in the long term, there is about 38 acres though, just immediately south of Linwood to the houses that back or that front onto Indian Creek Line or Indian Line East. Can't remember the name of it. That property has just changed hands again. I think it was planned for about 40 homes. So, you know, since that property's changed ownership again, perhaps the new owner will be motivated to build in that subdivision, that new subdivision. That's a subdivision approval from 2008. So, you know, those approvals were sought 13 or 14 years ago. And, you know, for one reason or another, the owner and the investors opted that it wasn't the right time for them to move forward with their business plan. But again, with this market, I expect the new developer may be motivated to do that on those lands.
Thanks, Ryan. Any other questions? Tom Story, please. Oh, are you take off mute there?
Yeah. Ryan, in your presentation, you talked about the work from home trend that's happening everywhere. And in a largely rural municipality like our own, having reliable internet access is a key to taking advantage of that trend. So can you just briefly outline the various initiatives to improve and extend internet access out into our rural areas. I know it's happening in the urban areas, but the countryside is also an area where that kind of growth could occur.
No, that's a good question, Tom. I can speak, I guess, very, very generally to this, but you're right. For Chatham-Kent and residents and employees in Chatham-Kent, reliable high-speed internet is a necessity, and frankly, it's a national priority. It should be a national priority to bring high-speed internet to all parts of Canada, including rural Chatham-Kent. There's been considerable investment by the federal government, provincial government and local municipalities over the past several years. So some of the incumbents like Bell and Cogeco and Tech Savvy have extended their fiber network in our urban areas. And other companies such as ExploreNet and Tech Savvy are rapidly accelerating their plans to bring high-speed internet to rural areas. I know ExploreNet is actively seeking to build several towers around the municipality. Tech Savvy is investing in major backbone infrastructure in many rural areas across the municipality. And over the next several years, there'll either be direct fiber lines through some of the rural areas, or there'll be towers or connection points where homes and businesses will be more able to connect to this high-speed network, which is huge. Students moving to online education will be able to attend college and university from their home in a rural area. Farmer may be able to trade the grain in his bins right from his home in real time, in the markets that exist in agriculture. Really, the possibilities are endless for how that could impact the local economy and keep people living in rural areas of Chatham-Kent because they have access to that critical infrastructure. And young people and students and people and entrepreneurs aren't forced to move out of the country and into urban areas, or not start a business or not seek education at all. It's really getting beyond land use planning, but those are just some of my thoughts on it. But certainly there's an initiative there to do that.
One more, Tom?
Yeah, if you'd like me to thank him after that, I can just go roll into that.
Well, I've got one more after.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to point out, Ryan, that as one of the members of the Rotary Club that works on youth exchange, now I've only been doing it since maybe 2011 or so, but for some reason they decided to cut Australia off of the list that we can send our young students to. Now that primarily is because of English speaking. So you might have been one of the last groups that was able to go, and I'm just wondering, was there anything happen in Australia we should know about?
What happens in Australia stays in Australia.
Australia.
So,
Well, I was very happy to hear that you had the chance to enjoy that experience. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, it may just be a coincidence, but we got cut off from Australia after Ryan came home. So, and it's also interesting, we hosted an exchange student at our house who was from Cairns. And if Barry was on, we could talk about Lauren, because the Fraser family all was a host for her, but that's a major coincidence. Just getting back to your comments on the internet access, Ryan. This isn't a question, it's just a statement from me, and I want you to think about it when we talk in the future. And that is, planning is often, in my experience, catching up to where social trends are taking us. We're not necessarily on the leading edge, we're trailing. And when I asked that question, I think providing these economic development opportunities in the rural areas on a micro scale means it's going to have profound impacts on our land use policies in rural areas. I don't want to get into what they might be. I just like to say that they exist, and you and I should talk sometime about getting in front of that rather than getting caught up in trying to justify stuff for which there is no policy basis yet. So in closing, Ryan, thank you very much. Certainly it was an impressive, if compressed, analysis of what's going on in Chatham-Kent. I have no doubt we're in excellent hands going forward. And like I said in my presentation, I worked with Ryan all the way through, and we worked in a lot of other municipalities besides Chatham-Kent, particularly in Essex County and up in Lambton. And we've been as far as field as the Uxbridge area, for instance, and Fort Erie area. And zero of the planning departments even remotely are close to the experience and the capabilities of our own. I can say that with a lot of prejudice since I was part of it in a way for many years. But we are very, as much as you hear people complaining about planners, and of course we're self-deprecating sometimes to a fault, but we are very well served here, and Ryan's a good example of that. So thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Tom, and appreciate you saying that. And you know, there's been very few professional land use planners active in this region for decades. So I've really only been able to learn directly from very few. And Tom, you've had a great deal of influence on my career and my outlook to planning in Chatham-Kent, and I know you'll continue to do so. And so you've absolutely contributed, obviously, in your career to planning in Chatham-Kent. That's without question, and you'll continue to do so for a long time, simply because of the influence you've had on me. So I'll say that once, and you may not hear that for a while, Tom, but it's true. We're a small and passionate group, and this is a calling, and I'm happy to talk about it. So thank you for having me to the whole club and to President Brett, and happy to come back anytime.
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan. Just before we close out, let you know next week we'll have a couple of young ladies, Andrea Johnson and Megan Cowan, representing to us from Chatham-Kent Public Library. So I got the feeling, Tanya, we'll let you know right now. I'll ask you to do that introduction. We're currently in the middle of Mental Health Week for Canada. So a shout out, this is from May 3 to May 9. And we worked hard to try to get our connection established. And I think it's very well established with the CMHA and Ride Don't Hide. So lots of room on that team to go through and sign up for Ride Don't Hide, which will take place next month through the month of June. And as I said last week, if we don't get you on the team, we'll definitely go towards getting you to sponsor some of the team members. And May 15, I think was the date, District 6380 will have their a virtual conference. So feel free to sign on right from your own home, 9 o'clock in the morning till 11:30. Hopefully the next weekend, May 22, District 6380 has a watershed cleanup and sort of a Chatham-Kent pitch in. So we're going to hope that unless the lockdown continues, we can go out to a couple of areas and just do some work on that. So that pretty much covers it for today. And I'll ask Julia, if you're still with us, if you wouldn't mind playing us out, please.